Good morning. Thanks very much for the kind invitation to come talk to you today. So I run a research group at UCL, and we kind of have three broad goals. One is to develop the scientific evidence base for risk and protective factors for violent extremism. The second one is to do evaluations of counter-terrorism practice. So we've got various different members of our team embedded in different parts of practice, undertaking process and outcome evaluations. And it's also to develop tools and instruments to help us measure radicalization, whether that be from a sort of methodological standpoint or from a practice standpoint. So through the development of tools and instruments. And it was all, what we focused on for the last 10 years. But it was largely a sort of an accident, and it was never kind of the plan or strategy for us to go there. We kind of ended up going down this route after a series of extenuating circumstances that were beyond our own control. As you might guess from the accent, I'm Irish, and really what I want to study is a sort of a behavioural science approach to understanding the historical conflict in Northern Ireland, but there's no research funding in it, so we keep on having to sort of go off down on these other kind of tangents. And in 2012 was really where we began, where we were sort of in the midst of a project on lone actor terrorism. And we were given the job of trying to develop the evidence base of what these guys looked like, what their kind of developmental trajectories looked like prior to their offending, what were the kind of tripwires that might be put in place to help us give a sense that there's an imminent escalation of risk in an individual case. And as we were starting off that project, the kind of what was out there in the research field was quite heavily theoretical, quite sort of speculative, very little that was operationally focused or that could be sort of taken, cut and paste into policy or into practice. So we were faced with a number of kind of challenges at the beginning of that project. But essentially there was a lot of sort of very commonly held mantras which have sort of changed and ebbed and flowed over the course of the last 10 years as empiricism has really I'd nearly said exploded, but that'd be the wrong term for this field, has really gotten bigger. And there's kind of more and more interest from various different disciplines engaged in this, trying to develop the evidence base. So essentially, when we were starting out that project in 2012, there was a lot of kind of consensus that there is no single individual socio-demographic profile, that we kind of need to stop thinking about profiles and think about the developmental pathways through which people go from a state of being into a sort of radicalized state of being, that there's no kind of one single silver bullet explanation for how people get there, that it's multi-determined, that there's lots of different factors going on, that there might be different pathways from person to person, that sometimes people with initial similar states may end up in very different outcomes, some of which might be harmful, some of which might be pro-social. There was sort of a lot of talk within the terrorism studies fields that we need to learn from other fields, but often those fields that were cited were like religious studies or social movement studies. And at that time, there was like next to no work from a criminological perspective on terrorism studies. It was just a sort of a massive void, essentially. There was also a consensus at the time that mental health and personality factors played no role. And essentially what was out there and what was known was largely based on jihadi cases. And there was a lot of hysteria at the time about what was commonly called within the media and within policy lone wolf terrorism, that it's spontaneous, irrational, impossible to stop. It could happen anywhere at any time with any given weapon. And there was also this kind of commonly held view within the field that closed source data was the gold standard and that there was very little else that could be of value for practice. And essentially, lots of these mantras were based on little more than kind of anecdote and little more than kind of conceptual building. There was very little kind of robust research designs or empiricism behind much of these things. And as I said, these have kind of majorly flourished over the last kind of 10 years. And really the only one that sort of had some sort of data underpinning it was the work of Mark Sageman. And, at the time you weren't allowed to say it, but there was lots of like really kind of questionable methodological assumptions built into that work as well, which we can say now. So we're going to talk to you about some of the things that we've kind of where we went to from this initial starting point in 2012 and what was supposed to be an initial one-year project on lone actors, where again the brief was to build a database of who these guys were, what they did in their backgrounds, and try to basically put a prevalence rate on all of the different factors that were assumed to be important for radicalization and engagement in terrorism. because essentially we had no prevalence rates at that particular point in time. And essentially the kind of questions that we've been getting from both academia and also from practice have gotten more fine-grained over the course of those 10 years. So the more we try to answer, the better the kind of questions get over time, which then leads us to sort of have to go and do another 2 or 3 years worth of a research program and delay our work on Northern Ireland. So various different parts of our work have fed into practice within UK counter-terrorism and elsewhere over the last 10 years. Some of it is influential in the sort of lead generation space in terms of what are the leads that people should be looking out for, the kind of work that we do around behavioural leakage and verbal leakage in the build-up to a terrorist attack. Some of our work focuses on initial prioritisation of cases and triage based on very finite bits of information. What are the cases that we shine a light upon? Some of it focuses on management and case closure. Some of it is now increasingly looking at that sort of recidivism space as more and more individuals that have served time for terrorism act offences are going back out into the community. But essentially the very first step that we were faced with was like get an account of how often these supposed risk factors occur, right? So we were left flailing around with going, okay, well, what risk factors are we going to count the sort of numbers on? And, you know, when we started out that project, we had an initial 12-month ask. So we dipped into that wider, essentially conceptual, theoretical literature that was out there on radicalization, hulled down all of the sort of vulnerability factors or risk factors that were theorized and hypothesized about and tried to get a count on them. Now, somewhat worryingly, we could find about 185 factors that were sort of mentioned or hypothesized and thrown out there in the theoretical literature, but we could only find 119 lone actor terrorists. So it's a bit of a worry when there's far more risk factors than there are actual individuals perpetrating these offences. So we knew that there was something going on that was wrong in there. So we were sort of happy with this one-year project just to sort of pinpoint which ones commonly occur most often, and then we'll call them risk factors, and then we'll get back to Northern Ireland. And essentially, that sort of first study led to the bombing alone study, which is sort of widely cited in various different risk assessment instruments today. But essentially, it was the first one that kind of focused on a kind of full life course events of these individuals prior to their offending and during their offending space. So, you know, we were one of the first that could identify how often they had criminal convictions in their background, like really basic things that you think would have been highly populated at that particular time, but just there had been a vast, mass overlooking of these issues. So things like criminal histories, things like the degree to which they were alone during their radicalization space, the degree to which they told people within their immediate social networks about their attitudes, about their intentions, about their capabilities to engage in violence. We had a tiny little paragraph that spoke about what we felt was quite high rates of mental health disorders diagnosed. And we said, isn't this really interesting? We don't know what this means. We're certainly not saying that it causes lone actor terrorism. We'll just move on to the next risk factor. And we sort of had it was just a really basic kind of descriptive analysis of the data. And then soon after that, I moved to the UK to work at the Jill Dando Institute. And there was a bit of a focus within counter-terrorism policing to put some of this early work into practice, but they were a little bit reticent on doing that based purely on open source information. So that initial study came from about 5,500 hours of undergraduate interns culling through every single piece of open source information we could find on particular offenders. So there was a bit of a reluctance to operationalize some of this because it was open source. So under Project Regulus, myself and Emily Corner, who's based here in Canberra now, in partnership with the Northwest Counter-Terrorism Unit, had access to police files, intelligence files. In some of the cases, there were offender interviews. In some other cases, there were interviews with the family. And essentially, we replicated all of the kind of main findings that we could get from the open source information. Maybe we could get a little bit granular in terms of the sort of temporal ordering of things. So this happened, then that happened a month later. Maybe we could get a little bit more granular in terms of the types of radicalizing materials they were looking at online. But for the most part, the closed source information validated what we'd found in the open sources. And, you know, sort of big take-home finding is essentially, there's no silver bullet explanation, which had been sort of theorized quite heavily, but we could sort of articulate this now with empiricism, that usually it was a sort of a crystallization of multiple risk factors coming together at the same time that the individual is exposed to a radicalizing ideology or at the time that they decide to do something about it. So it was usually a combination of a wide range of different factors that were kind of broadly similar. They won't be surprising to anybody that was doing research in general violence risk assessment or in sexual violence risk assessment and all this type of stuff. So I think in terms of, like I said, 10 years ago, there was very little that was being informed by forensic psychology, that was being informed by criminology, but essentially what we've done in this violent extremism space is stand on the shoulders of all those giants that have worked in these other fields of violent crime and harm, and we've essentially replicated a lot of the stuff that is well known within those particular fields. So it's usually a combination, a crystallization of multiple things coming together at the same time. So we were happy that we'd counted all these risk factors and ready to move on, but then we started getting kind of those finer grained questions. So like, for example, how often, is this just a lone actor issue, or is this sort of for terrorism writ large? Does this also apply to the radicalized writ large, or is this just a sort of a lone actor phenomenon that we're finding? This issue around greater levels of mental health problems, there's greater issues around criminal violence and other types of issues. So it necessitated going out and doing that kind of large-scale data collection all over again with different sort of samples of violent extremist offenders to really kind of scratch below the surface of what we thought we knew about radicalization. And again, one of the sort of early pieces of work, which was led by Emily Corner, who was fundamental to a lot of the success that we've had over the last 10 years, was this early comparison work of our lone actor terrorists with individuals who committed their offences as part of a command and control group infrastructure. And essentially what Emily found in that sort of matched control research design was that issues to do with mental health disorder diagnoses were significantly greater in amongst our lone actor sample compared to those who offended as part of a group. It was much, much higher within the lones. And essentially, one of the things that sparked that initial research idea was that despite the fact in bombing alone, we had kind of completely caveated what we thought we were saying about the issue, that as in we don't know, we just know how prevalent it is, we don't know what it means. A lot of the early citations of our work were basically misciting us and saying these guys have shown mental health disorders cause lone actor terrorism. So it sort of necessitated us doing more work to try to kind of calm people's boots on that front. And essentially what we found here was that it was significantly greater in amongst our lone actors, but it had very little kind of impact upon issues to do with attack planning, spontaneity. They still went through the same degree of kind of rational, purposive, methodical thinking in terms of maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risks as part of their attack planning. When we looked at the wider criminological literature that compared lone offenders to group offenders across a wide range of crimes, you quite often find that this is basically a really common finding, that in different crimes from burglary through to homicide, lone offenders generally tend to have greater kind of mental health disorders within those samples versus group offenders. So again, it kind of one of the mantras that we have within our research group is that terrorism and radicalization is just another form of violent offending, and that we shouldn't treat it as this sort of other kind of distinct issue. We should be taking in as much learning as we can from the brilliant decades of research that have been done in other spaces. And so that was a comparison of our lone offenders and our group offenders. And then we also got a little bit of interest from the United States to further develop our work, looking at people who engage in really similar types of violence to lone actor terrorists. So people who engage in mass acts of violence in ostensibly public places against strangers. So the violence looks very similar, but they kind of have slightly different motivational structures. So do they differ? Do our lone actors differ from our school shooters and workplace violence types? So we did another big data collection crawl over the course of 2 years for the National Institute of Justice. And essentially what we found were they were essentially the same pool of people. There was very, very little that distinguished our lone actor terrorists from these other forms of mass public violence offenders. really similar levels of risk factors and protective factors within their backgrounds. And really the only thing that separated the two categories came to attack planning. So whereas your school shooters and your workplace violence types were engaging in violence in their routine spaces, so in their schools, in their workplaces, they didn't need to do as sort of lengthy an attack planning process because they were well aware of the sort of security deficiencies or the attractiveness of different types of targets. Whereas often with our lone actors, they were going to spaces that they were unfamiliar with, so it necessitated doing hostile reconnaissance and dry runs and virtual reconnaissance and all these different types of things. So in terms of the background trajectory, really similar in terms of background risk factors and protective factors, but it was only when it came to the attack commission that you started to see them diverge in terms of their behavioral footprint. We sort of look at radicalization through a public health lens, and we think that, if somebody, the thing that differentiates these two types of offenders is what they're exposed to at the time when all of these risk factors were catalyzing away for them and having that kind of negative impact. So if I come in here and my immune system's down and you all have the flu, I'm going to catch the flu. If I come in here with my immune system's down and you all have COVID, you better believe I'm catching COVID. And we look at it in the same way with these guys. It really sort of matters what they were exposed to at the time that those risk factors were coming to the fore and sort of creating that space. And we see that now much more often. It's sort of very commonly held at the time. And also with our guys within these samples, quite often there's a mix of different kind of grievances going on there. Yeah, they have an ideology, the lone actor terrorists, but you scratch below the surface of it, and quite often there's really severe personal grievances coming to the fore that's dictating some of the decision-making about timing or victims. When you look at the school shooters, sure, you can say they're personally aggrieved, but when you scratch below the surface of that, they are trying to articulate some sort of a social, political change. It's just that they're 17-year-olds and it's kind of inarticulate and not very well put together, or it looks quite idiosyncratic to them. So the differences between these types of offenders aren't quite as clear-cut as one might assume, or certainly people were assuming a number of years ago. So we thought we were happy then. We've studied different forms of violent extremists and different forms of public violent offenders, like mass violent offenders. Happy days, that's what a risk factor is. Let's move to Northern Ireland. And then we'd start, presenting at more and more academic conferences, and there'd always be somebody up the front who's sort of saying, well, you're only studying violent offenders. You don't really have a control group, so they're not really risk factors, which they were absolutely right. Of course they were right. But it necessitated a few more years of work to try to sort of build that data to help underpin that. And, again, Emily Corner. Really, Emily should be given the first half of this talk. The data was available for general population data in terms of mental health disorders that were prevalent within Western societies. So we could lean quite heavily upon large-scale, really robust meta-analyses of epidemiological studies within Western populations. So, a lot of those circle around the number 25, 26% that in these societies, it'll be 1 in 4 chance that somebody in their adult years will have gotten a diagnosis of a mental health disorder. So we could compare our different offending types to that general base rate. And we could see, it was significantly higher in amongst our mass murderers and our lone actor terrorists. But as the sort of offending became more networked and more group-based, the prevalence rates dipped down well below what you'd expect to see within the general population base rate. One little caveat on that, I would say, is that also one of the big differentiators between our lone offenders and our group offenders, and this is true for a wide range of crimes, is that our lone offenders tended on average to be significantly older than our group-based offenders. So maybe they just weren't around on this earth long enough to get their disorders diagnosed, or maybe, probably more likely, there's a very different range of risk and protective factors that are pushing younger people than maybe those that are, in their mid-30s and above into these types of offending. And of course, talking about sort of mental health disorders as if it's a singular thing is insufficient. So Emily led on a piece of work that disaggregated across the different diagnoses, and we could see within our lone actor space, significantly higher rates of schizophrenia, delusional disorder, autism spectrum disorder compared to the general base rate of the population, but significantly lower rates of things like depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, and a wide range of other things. Now, there are, in our UK language, and I'll return to this in a later slide, these are our pursue cases. These are people that have mobilized the violence. So they're sort of being pursued by intelligence and police. We also have quite good data on our prevent space. So these are individuals that haven't mobilized into violent offending, but they're in the early sort of PVE, CVE space. So they're dipping their toes into the water, into the ideological water. Maybe they're starting to talk a little bit, but there's no intelligence picture that they've mobilized to criminal offending. So they're in that sort of early prevention space. And just like in our pursue space, we see significantly greater rates of psychotic disorders and autism spectrum disorders diagnosed. But here we see the opposite of our pursue space. So we see significantly greater rates of depression, significantly greater rates of anxiety than what you'd expect to find in the general population. So it led us to start thinking that maybe, we know that radicalization and the engagement in terrorism is often the outcome of a pathway, of a sequence of observable behaviors and patterns of thinking. But maybe over the course of that pathway, certain factors might come to the fore and be more prevalent. They might actually disable them from getting further down that pathway as well. So the things that might be a risk factor for getting radicalized might not necessarily be the same risk factors for engagement in violence in the end plate. So we need to sort of think about this in a much more kind of complex way. And if you're thinking about the individuals that cross over the thresholds to engage in violence, they're trying to change the world in some sort of social, political way. They're up against a much more powerful government unit. The odds are set against them. Having an anxiety disorder is probably not what you're looking for to sort of help get in the right frame of mind to be able to condition yourself to be able to do it and step over the line. And hopefully later this year, we're going to be doing some work in the prisons. We've got basically a few of the green lights to do interviews with people who planned or carried out terrorist attacks in the UK. And these are some of the issues that we're going to try and sort of play on. We also see in our pursue space, when those individuals who had clinical depression in their background, what were they doing? They were sort of largely heavily socially isolated, at home, reliant on a virtual community, doing a lot of ideating about it, but not quite acting upon it. And it was only after the sort of medication kicked in that they felt they had the self-efficacy to go and act upon something that they'd been ideating about for a long, long period of time. So again, the sort of more complex understanding we can get of risk assessments, the sort of more creative we can get with our interventions around individual cases. So yeah, let's move on. So we had that kind of data from these epidemiological studies about how often certain mental health disorders occur within the general population. But for all of those other risk factors, there was essentially no literature that was out there. Sort of general violence risk assessment is, compared to violent extremism risk assessment research, is data rich, right? There's far more of those types of offenders. The people who are doing those types of work are far more embedded in those practices. And quite often what that research is focusing on is comparing recidivists to non-recidivists. So they have that as their sort of control group is the non-recidivists. But there's very much fewer research designs that compare just people within the general population who don't go on to be offenders in the first place, or violent offenders in the first place, versus those violent offenders. So we couldn't really find much about the general population and how often you'd expect to find ACEs, or how often you'd expect to find a wide range of other factors that we felt were quite important. So we developed a range of survey experiments to try to go out to general members of the public and ask them really sensitive questions about their developmental years, their thoughts, their attitudes, the types of things that they've been exposed to. And when we look at the general population and compare them to our sort of terrorist samples, you see lots of the kind of classic risk factors from general violence come to the fore. So our terrorism offenders were significantly more likely to have violent offending histories, significantly more likely to have like deviant peers, family dysfunction, problems with sort of leisure activities, very, very few protective factors. So we found lots of people in the general population with a crystallization of risk factors, but what we often found alongside them was a large amount of very pro-social protective factors, which were managing to keep the risk factors at bay. And up until this point, we had really only measured risk factors, which was a really big kind of problem that we only realized too late, because if we're only looking at risk factors, we're only going to see risk and we're going to potentially throw up way too many false positives. So the influence of protective factors really kind of came to the fore for us here in that particular study, and is informing the next generation of our work that we're about to go on. So a lot of this early stuff was inspired by the lone actor threat, but we were, again, battling with this kind of control group issue, which made us sort of reach beyond our lone actors and look into other kind of risk spaces. And various different studies that we do, we measure radicalization as one of 4 different things, and you're going to sort of see this picture pop up in different slides before I finish. And the ones that are highlighted are the kind of definitions of radicalization that we used. So we sometimes measure it as a belief system, sometimes we look at it as attitudinal, sometimes we look at it as intent, and sometimes we look at it as behavior. All slightly different things, and we think that different risk and protective factors will come to the fore depending on if you're measuring beliefs, attitudes, intentions, or behavior. So I believe Guinness is good for me. My attitude is I should consume as much of it as possible. My intention is to sort of hang around here till lunchtime, and then my behavior is going to be atrocious later on. There's different parts of me that might explain those different things that come together, right? My belief system might be explained by the streets that I'm from, where I am indulged with lots of Guinness propaganda telling me it's good for me. My attitude might be explained by my cognitive deficit and my inability to sort of critically think and parse my way through the propaganda. My intention might be explained by the fact my boss thinks I'm going to be working all day. And my behavior might be explained by the fact I've got like addictive personality traits. I don't do much, but when I do things, I do it to the nth degree. So there's different parts of me that might explain different parts of that sequence of observable behaviors and thinking processes that got me to that point where I've consumed a lot of Guinness. So there's different factors that might explain different parts, right? There's no one factor that explains each part of the chain. And when we talk about beliefs and attitudes, essentially we're talking about those early PVE and CVE spaces. And when we're talking about intentions and behaviors, it moves much more to the pursue space. So just let me reiterate, we had really good data on the offenders, those who crossed the threshold into violence. And we had really good data on the general public. And we had decent data in the sort of CVE, PVE space. What we didn't really have great data on was like individuals that were making lots of noise, maybe on online forums, and which of those who made loads and loads of noise went on to be offenders. It was impossible for us to do it in essentially an ethical and proportional way, because a lot of the noise generated on extremist forums, it's anonymous posters. There's no way of kind of doing those follow-ups. So we ended up doing quite a lot of close work with the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre, FTAC in London, who managed the threats posed to the royal family and British public figures. And I realise this sentence sounds strange, but the nice thing about people that threaten the royal family is that they often leave their name at the bottom of the letter. So you can get all of that follow-up information. So we had really good data on police data, from health data, and we could start to compare those people who made lots and lots of noise and threats, but who never followed up, versus those who showed up at the scene and tried to scale the fence, and in one case got his foot inside the Queen's bed. And we could sort of compare the two, right? The noisemakers versus the actual actualizers who got close to doing something about their grievance. And these might seem like a strange and funky bunch of people, and because they are, but there is a large degree of overlap with our lone actors in terms of the forms of mental health disorders that are seen, the nature of their fixated, personalized grievances, the nature of conspiratorial thinking that's within this set. They're really similar. They've just kind of gotten aggrieved and fixated on a slightly different issue versus our lone actors. And in some cases, maybe might have been a FTAC case at one particular point in time, and then went on to engage in ISIS-related violence or went on to engage in school violence and so on. So again, the kind of boundaries between these people aren't so clear once we start collecting data on them. So those who kind of made the approaches versus those who only made noise, again, we could see lots of our kind of classic risk factors that we know from general violence risk assessment come to the fore. Significantly more likely to have a previous criminal record, significantly more likely to have substance abuse problems, previous violence attempts, evidence of overt mental disorders. And we also found the kind of clinical nurses within the team would code the nature of the communicated threat for various different forms of language. And we found that what they coded as grandiose language and diluted content was significantly more associated with an elevated behavioral risk. And we saw various other kind of factors that weren't so significantly associated with approach behaviors. But again, the same factors that were differentiating our lone actors from our general population, the ones that made noise versus those who didn't, they were the same factors that were coming to the fore time and time again. And, you know, again, so history of violence, 60% more likely, criminal history, 57% more likely, and so on. So we also did another general population survey where we asked people a range of questions about their exposure to radicalizing settings, radicalizing content, and radicalizers. We could go into great detail about how we encourage people to report this in a safe and ethical way. We've done various different follow-up studies, and the percentages within our nationally representative studies have gone up about 15 to 20% on most of these indicators that we've measured, you know, over the course of 6 times over the course of 2.5 years. So we asked people to self-report whether in the previous 12 to 24 months they'd engaged in any of these kind of behaviors. And as I said, lots of these kind of numbers are going up. Maybe it's associated with lockdown and having more time in our hands and more heavily reliant on the internet or whatever the case may be. But we've also seen a rise over the course of the last 2.5 years in self-reported misogynistic attitudes, self-reported endorsements of political violence, like support for political violence to effect change, and a wide range of other issues. And what were the things that sort of separated them? Experience and prejudice. So maybe that is one of those factors that might differentiate this form of violence risk assessment than general violence risk assessments, because there is a underlying political, social, religious cause behind it. So the experience of prejudice might go hand in hand with that form versus other forms of violence. Those who self-reported psychological distress, those who self-reported being thrill seekers and low in self-control, all significantly more likely. These are just some of the kind of bigger effect sizes that we could pull out. And married is just one of those examples of protective factors, but essentially all the protective factors we measured significantly differentiated those who were getting themselves exposed to radicalizing materials, contents, settings, versus those who didn't. And now increasingly what we're trying to do is model. I don't think it's enough to sort of say that it's a crystallization of multiple risk factors. We need to actually be able to sort of model what this looks like to help the risk assessment and management process. And we're doing this in various different ways. And I think in some ways we're going beyond the types of methodological approaches that are done in general violence risk assessments. Because they're such a data-rich field, maybe they haven't needed to innovate in some of the methodologies that our kind of more data-sparse field has had to do. And, you know, again, like no matter how many times I say it, you know, every time I have a meeting, some policymaker or practitioner or journalist or fellow academic, they all kind of fixate on one risk factor and they want that to be the sort of risk factor that rules all and sort of explains everything. And you're constantly sort of bashing the drum back to them to say that it's multiple factors crystallizing and coming back together. And we're trying to sort of visualize what this might look like in various different ways. So this was a sequence analysis that put all of the different experience of risk factors into a temporal ordering. So we know that it's a pathway, and we know that some behaviors are more likely to occur closer to the escalation of risk, and some might be much more static background risk factors. So just like in that, you know, our early citations of our work that said mental disorder caused lone actor terrorist attacks, when we sort of put them on a temporal ordering, we actually see that it's more of a cause of a cause of a cause of a cause, right? It's much more a background thing, and it typically precedes other types of behaviors and experience, which themselves might cascade into other experiences and behaviors, which then sort of snowball out of control. But typically we can sort of start to map what the average lone actor mobilization looks like. If somebody's engaging in one type of behavior, we can sort of know with fairly good probabilities what the next behavior that might occur in that chain of behaviors might be based on our knowledge of previous cases. Also doing some work in the sort of structural equation modeling with the general population stuff, which we can sort of see, the experience of individual strains and collective strains might lead to a sense of anomie and a sense of living on the edges of society and not being cared for and looked after. Sort of crystallization of those three things leads to really high levels of legal cynicism and cynicism towards the police, towards lawmakers, towards the sort of infrastructures of the state. That then is significantly more likely a sort of a high effect size, that the higher legal cynicism our individuals reported, the more likely they were to sort of be exposed to individuals that they self-reported as having extremist attitudes and beliefs. And then that in turn has a moderate relationship upon violent extremist intentions. So you have these people that are kind of coming from sort of a sense of strain, feeling isolated, feeling cynical about legal processes and moving on. But then you've also got that other pack of people that are just low in self-control and don't need any other underlying grievances or risk factors, and that by itself is sufficient to get people to the point of expressing radical intentions. And we're also drawing a lot from individualized medicine, where they're kind of moving away from the traditional sort of logistic regression model of understanding risk factors and thinking about like risk factors as a complex system. And that if we can attack those factors that are kind of high in betweenness in the same way you'd look at a social network, then you might be able to sort of disrupt that network in time. So we can start to sort of map on which risk factors tend to co-occur and which are the sort of gateway factors which lead to the end outcomes that we're interested in. Because they're the ones that are high in betweenness, that link lots and lots of risk factors to the exposure to radicalizing settings. They're the ones that you'll get the best bang for your buck with in terms of interventions. So just to quickly finish up, Northern Ireland research is still years away. We are, much more heavily focused now on moving away from the presence of risk factors to looking at the sort of functional relevance that they play. So we've moved from a state of 10 years ago of being told there's not enough data and we can't do enough with individual case studies, to now sort of saying actually the next sort of work needs to be that kind of heavily ideographically inclined, rich individual case study work to really get a sense of the functional relevance of these factors. Trying to do a lot more theoretical and empirical work on protective factors. We've got a heavy emphasis in the next few years on doing replications and meta-analyses on some of our kind of commonly held beliefs. And some of our work is translating into current day practice with risk assessments, and we're trying to do a lot of work on evaluations. How do we translate research to practice to make sure that our caveats are captured, and how do we match treatment to need? And essentially what we've come to the conclusion with 10 years later is a number of other sort of conventional wisdoms. So yeah, there is no profile, but certain people might be attracted to certain types of roles, that there might be a role quality to certain types of terrorist outputs, and certain types of people might be more attracted to those roles. It's not a case of looking at profiles or pathways, but we need to think about how certain types of profiles might be attracted to certain types of pathways, that there's an interaction between the two. We can agree that radicalization is multi-determined, but again, what constitutes a validated risk factor is still up for debate. We'd heavily agree, but now we've got empiricism behind it, that different pathways can lead to radicalization, that initially similar people can end up with different outcomes. And traditionally now we're taking in a lot more learning, which is much better for risk assessment from criminology, from threat assessments, from sort of individualized medicine to help us with our intervention planning. And we know that mental health and personality factors do, of course, play roles, but these roles can really change from case to case. 10 years ago, the status was that they had no role. Now we know a lot about the jihadi and extreme right, but there's much more of a complex threat landscape in front of us right now. So some of these factors might play differently in some of those other threat landscapes. We know that lone actor terrorism and radicalization is the end result of understandable, discernible process of thinking. Let's not get, too defeatist about this like we were 10 years ago. And closed source data, whilst having its sort of strengths, what we really think is that it helps complement some of our other open source initiatives. Thanks very much for your time. There's follow-up information there. We've got research briefs on all of those individual papers on our grievance project website. Thank you.